Welcome to The Deepening, a podcast that explores the inner journey and its relationship to our outer life through the lens of Jungian psychology, spirituality, and personal transformation. I'm your host, Suzanne Larue. Let's journey inward together. In this episode, I speak with comparative mythologist Maria Souza, host of the Women in Mythology podcast, which is part of the Joseph Campbell Foundation's Mythmaker podcast network. If you listened to my last episode with Lisa Marciano about dreams, you'll notice a natural continuation here. We remain in the symbolic life, exploring how the unconscious speaks to us through images, stories, and symbols, and how these messages can guide us on a soul level. As Joseph Campbell said, dreams are private myths and myths are public dreams. Maria brings this idea to life beautifully. She holds a postgraduate degree in comparative mythology, a master's in ecology and spirituality, advanced training in applied mythology from Pacifica Graduate Institute, and she is also trained in narrative therapy. In our conversation, we explore how myths illuminate our lives, revealing the psychological patterns we live out and offering pathways towards self-compassion, healing, and growth. As Maria says, there is a story for every threshold. And in this episode, she offers a rich and insightful retelling of the Russian tale of Vasilisa, especially as it relates to the midlife journey. I hope you'll enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Hello, Maria. Thank you for being here.
Hi, Suzanne. Thank you so much for having me. Hello, everyone.
I thought we'd just start broadly with why you think it's important to engage with myth and ancient story in our contemporary life. What relevance does it hold for us?
For me, myths are mirrors and maps. They really help us better understand our inner life. They help us reconnect with our soul. And it's almost like they're saying, stop and listen. Once we listen to a story or we read a tale, we begin a reflection on what troubles me here. Where do I see myself in this story? And then it opens a door for us to better understand our lives. So a lot of my love for myths, a love for stories comes from this place. Through my own personal journey, I have benefited immensely from myths. I have truly transformed my life when it comes to self-esteem, my creative life, my relationship with others, my spirituality and my relationship in the world as well. All of those things have transformed through myth. So I've witnessed in my life and I've witnessed in the life of other women.
Yeah, you say that working with myth helps awaken our soul and call us back to our most authentic selves. Can you give an example of that?
Absolutely. So, for example, the story of Psyche and Eros, there is a story in which she is a very beautiful woman, young, uninitiated, and she goes through a journey in which she needs to learn how to trust herself. She needs to become herself. She follows her curiosity. She commits a sacred transgression. She then is in some ways exiled, and she needs to complete a series of tasks to return. And finally, she becomes a goddess at the end. But all this story, this myth, it holds different aspects for us. We can see and remember perhaps a time in which there was a longing, there was a curiosity call that we followed that led to a sacred transgression in our life. When I talk about sacred transgression, it is something that we've done to go against the norm, let's say, but it is a sacred one. Sacred because it's necessary for the initiation to begin, for the journey of becoming self to begin. And we have all done a sacred transgression. So when we listen to the story of Psyche and Eros, even if in the beginning someone says like, oh, she was living in the castle, in the palace and everything was fine. She had everything provided to her. She was so happy actually and in love with her husband, Eros. But why did she want to know more? It was her right to know. She had the right to have consciousness over her life. life. So she followed her curiosity. She wanted more. And it reminds us of that we are allowed, that perhaps long ago when we claimed more and some people or society, culture in general, said that that was being selfish, that was wanting too much. We can reclaim that. We can re-signify that story, befriend that story in our lives as well. And then, of course, I believe a woman doesn't have just one myth. I believe in a wide repertoire of stories. There's a story for when we are changing careers. There's a story for when we are traveling motherhood, a story for menopause, a story, to relate to our creative life, a story for perfectionism. There are so many different tales for different themes in our lives. And we change, and even in a same period of time, we have different facets for ourselves.
I really love that idea of the sacred transgression, that it's necessary in order to become more fully ourselves. And that even if it seems to be going against what has been dictated or even promised, that it's important because it's what begins the initiation into becoming our fuller selves. And I love the idea that we can also hold many stories and that we can take hold of different stories at different points in our lives in order to support us through those phases. And you touched into a story that was specifically about a woman, but I know that you do work specifically with women and using story. Is there anything special about working with women in myth that you would want to share?
Well, I would say that myth is powerful to everyone. Myth is medicine to everyone. It's a door for everyone's soul. Then it's something very specific, to my passion is the myths of women. I do feel that we have different wounds than the wounds of men. We have different challenges, the different initiations, different journeys, the archetypal journeys that women share. And of course, there are as many ways as there are women in this world. So I want to honor women's individual journey as well, individual initiations, descents, and challenges. But there's something of the collective as well for women. And my passion is really for that. Of course, we share with men some of the same wounds, but I think there are some wounds that are very specific to women.
Yeah, I listened to your conversation with Lisa Marciano about motherhood, and I was struck by how the stories you discussed offer such a powerful psychological mirror for that split that women often feel in motherhood between the devotion to their children and the longing for their more freer, wild selves. And so I can see how, just in that exchange, how that is very particular to a woman's experience. And it kind of points both to how in one's life, when we're having a significant, challenging life phase, we can find a mirror in a story. And it also points to specifically how we can use a story about women to find a mirror for a time that's very unique to a woman's experience.
Absolutely. And just to add also a detail, yes, a myth can be used both for men and women in different ways, but I think there's also something of the symbolic realm of the adornment of the myth that speaks more to a woman than to a man. So, for example, men tend to like stories where there's a warrior and a battle, and a very long journey. However, myths for women, they tend to be, with a heroine in the journey, in the tale. They have a lot of nature elements in it. There's a lot of this moving from maiden to mother to crone. There's the meeting of the witch. There are so many symbols and archetypes that calls to a woman's soul, to a woman's psyche.
What do you notice changes when women begin to see their own experience through a mythic lens?
I feel the first one is a sense of self-compassion and befriending of their journey. If they were holding themselves with shame or guilt or trying to repress something, suddenly it's okay to feel that way. It's okay to talk about it. You are not alone. You also understand the collective journey that other women are going through when it comes to this specific, let's say, wound. So I feel that first sense of self-compassion is a very big one for women. And then bringing it to consciousness. So bringing their wounds, their pains, whatever has been suppressed to consciousness and gaining language to speak, gaining language to better understand it, different images, symbols, gaining the tools as well to start addressing it, transforming it, beginning that healing journey. And then finally, a stepping forward in their lives, a sense of confidence reemerges, inspiration, creativity, all these things I feel myth is very much a catalyst for.
Yeah, I'm hearing self-compassion and beginning to see the tools through the story for how someone might, begin their own healing process. But I'm also hearing this thread of belonging that comes from discovering a character in a story who mirrors your own experience.
Absolutely. I love this idea of befriending your story. It's this mythic idea of owning your myth as a living myth, your story as a living myth, your life's journey. And myths allow us to do that because we see the trenches, we see the difficulties, we understand the allies of these heroines. We understand all of that journey. And when we work with several myths as well, we kind of layer them up and we start to build our own mythic story. And then honor it, stand it, instead of living a life that is not ours. I think in a world of perfectionism, in a world where everyone needs to be easily explained, they want to be easily explained, they can't disagree with anyone. Owning our story and owning who we are, that sense of self, is revolutionary.
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to talk about some specific myths and particular thresholds, but before we do, I find it interesting that you use myth in helping women with their own creative practices, projects, helping them with, their facilitation and leadership. And so I'm just interested to deepen into how myth and symbol can function as guides in our creative and purpose-driven work.
I love that. One of the elements of my life or facets of my life that was most developed and that I saw the most change was my creative life. Myth really gave me that, not just inspiration to do the work, but that dismantling of what was holding me back from it. So for me to instigate and support a woman's creative life, I think it's one of those empowerment works that we can do for each other. And I help them include myths and symbolic work into their journey. And the idea is that whatever your creative life is, it can be deepened and it can be guided by myth and symbol. Either we would map the themes first, so the themes that are important to this person. What are those themes? Maybe there's a theme of descent. Maybe there is a theme of creation, like a creation story comes up. Maybe it's a theme of sorority. Maybe it's a theme of betrayal. What are the themes? And then we find the myths that mirror that. Sometimes we'll go the other way around as well. They come with a myth they love and we try to map it out to see how can that reflect in their creative work. So I work with actually a lot of authors. So they are bringing myths. So they might be telling stories of their life or even a romance, a novel, or they might be working, with a conceptual ideas and they want the myth to ground that. They want to use the myth as mirror, as an example, as an archetypal also pattern. Sometimes also it happens that it's not about myths, but it's more about the symbols, the symbolic language. So we work with the symbol of the egg, with the symbol, of the land or the symbol of the ocean, and different symbolic material appears as guide as well.
So it's like helping enrich whatever content they're working with by helping them find the symbols that might reflect that, but also deepen it and kind of reach people on that deeper unconscious level.
Yes, exactly. A lot of women want to use this material in different ways. They want to center around a woman's circle. They want to center around their work with women's cycles. They want to bring in relation to motherhood. So then how can you be a story carrier? How can you tell a tale? What are some of the things you could consider? How can you find your authentic voice in sharing a myth? And how can you structure in a way that feels that it carries integrity, it carries respect, it honors your journey, your life, your intention, and also those who are sitting with you, who are present with you.
How do you find the right stories for the people you're working with? I mean, there's so many stories and there's so much that you could draw on. So is there like a set of criteria that you're thinking about?
I think the archetypal theme is definitely there, a compass for me. When we start the conversation and I start thinking of a tale, I'm already focusing a little bit on that theme. Of course, depending on my mentee, we already had a conversation about the kinds of myths, the nature of the myths they want to explore. Are they more wild myths? Is she, for example, only looking at myths, or is she open to folk tales? Is fairy tales also in that mix? Does she want to focus on, let's say, her heritage? I always try to tailor it in different ways. And what I do is I tell them the story, see what catches their eyes, their hearts, see if there's a spark of interest there. And then we start deepening to see if that is the right myth for them, for that stage of their journey or the myth they want to work with.
It sounds like such a rich and engaging process. And as I was listening to you talk, I was thinking about the conversation I heard you have with Sharon Blackie. And I know that she's very much drawing from her own cultural tradition. And she talks a lot about paying attention to where you're from and really knowing place and where these stories evolve. And I'm wondering how that comes into play. And if you ever have concerns about, appropriating myths from other cultures, or if it's because it's part of the collective unconscious, is it okay for us to kind of pull from all of these different places as if we're not necessarily wanting it to be centered on our heritage?
I think that's a great reflection for us to have when we're working with myths. And I would advise caution, but also I wouldn't say that it's untouchable. It's a delicate balance and equilibrium there. How can we actually work with the different stories that are offered in the world and they're available, but in a way that is respectful, that holds integrity? I think also considering where they're from. For me, the most troublesome myths, the one that we need to be the most careful with, are the indigenous stories. Not just because they are very specific to a land, but also because that people have been very oppressed. And by using those myths, we might be taking something from them, and so much has been already taken from them. So I think those are the myths that I personally would be the most cautious with. I love Clarissa Pinkola Estes' perspective, in which she works with tales from around the world. In Women Who Run with the Wolves, you have the Crescent Moon Bear, which is a Japanese story. You have Manawi, which is a African American story. You have La Llorona, which is a Mexican tale. So there are tales from all around the world. And I really love this. I think when you work well with these stories, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I like that perspective of just proceeding with caution, but that it doesn't mean that it's off limits. And that view that you just described of drawing on all these different kinds of stories, because there really is a richness in that when you start to realize the common threads, the human threads, the mythic threads that are there in all of those stories, even though they may play out in different ways because of the place where those stories emerge. And I personally feel so moved by that. It helps me feel so connected on such a deep level.
Yes, I agree 100%. And I feel that it becomes a door, and then if you want to deepen and fully experience that myth and that mythic tradition as well, then you can dive deeper. But to explore it a bit, to tell it, to share it, to discuss it with other women or in group, it's actually a blessing. It's how we keep the story alive in many ways as well.
I love what you said about it being like a door. And I've done working with dreams in groups, and sometimes someone will share a dream, and once it's been shared, I'll sometimes work with it, and it becomes a door for me. Even though it may not have been my dream or my story, whatever's symbolic in it that it's bringing alive in me becomes part of my own process. Well, as you know, I work primarily with women in midlife, and so I thought it would be interesting to hear about the theme of midlife as a mythic threshold and to explore what such representations reveal to us.
I think midlife might be one of the biggest thresholds for women because it's really about letting go of that feeling of being nice, being available to everyone, being in service, and really looking within. How can you claim sovereignty? Might be the one of those. I think our journey of becoming, it's a journey of becoming sovereign. We're becoming sovereign, developing a strong sense of self, knowing who we are, claiming our life, claiming, our story. And at midlife, I feel that there is some kind of energetic pull that pushes us towards that claiming, even in a more stronger way. And many stories speak about that. So, for example, the Russian folktale of Vasilisa, in which we have Vasilisa there in a very maiden form, and she's learning to allow the different types of mother to come into her psyche. And Baba Yaga, the witch, she is a sovereign woman at midlife. Baba Yaga has a lot to teach a woman at midlife. She is not afraid to threaten. She is not afraid to ask for what she needs. She gives the tasks. So I think there are different stories that show us either the journey of going through midlife or that gives us figures, teachers for midlife.
Could you tell that for the listeners who might not be familiar with that story?
Absolutely. So we have Vasilisa, which is this young girl, and she begins the tale actually sitting at the deathbed of her mother. And her mother is very ill, and she gives Vasilisa a little doll. And she says to Vasilisa, if you need to know of something, ask the doll. Don't talk about the doll to anyone. Feed the doll, care for the doll, protect the doll. And with that, she dies. The father and Vasilisa grieve for a very long time, but as winter ends and the flowers bloom again, the father returns to life and he marries another woman who has two daughters. And here's a very archetypal image, right, that appears in many stories. And this stepmother now to Vasilisa and the two daughters are extremely mean to her and harass her and make her do different types of work around the house, and they do nothing. And the father one day leaves for work, and the mother and the two daughters, they conspire to kill Vasilisa. That's what they want to do. And they say, let's say that the fire in our house is out and send Vasilisa to get fire in Baba Yaga's house. And of course, Baba Yaga will eat her. So let's do that. And well, one day Vasilisa comes home and there's no fire. She says, what happened? And the stepmother says, well, the fire is out. You need to go to Baba Yaga's house to get it. Vasilisa doesn't actually hesitate and she says, okay, I will go. So she goes out into the forest. She hasn't been into the forest. They live at the edge of the woods, and she doesn't know which way to go, but she remembers her doll, and she touches that little doll that her mother gave her years ago. And she asks, which way should I go? This way or that way? This way or that way? And the doll always tells, go this way now. And finally she arrives, and it's quite a house. It lives on top of chicken legs. The doorknobs are made of bones. It has a fence around it that is made with skulls that are on fire. And as she's taking all in, this very different, terrifying house, exactly, a witch descends, and this is Baba Yaga. And she immediately asks, what are you here for? And she says, I want fire. And Baba Yaga says, I can give you fire, but only if you do a few tasks for me. And she gives Vasilisa a few tasks. Some of these tasks are separating a big pile of dirt and poppy seed, an impossible task, honestly, because there are millions and millions and millions of poppy seeds in there. And of cleaning the house, of laundering her clothes, cooking her food. And Vasilisa knows that is impossible. She will never complete that in time as well. There's a time frame, a clock ticking. And the doll says, don't worry, have some food, sleep, and all will be done. And indeed, the doll does the tasks. Baba Yaga returns. She is pleased that the tasks are done, but kind of angry at it as well, because there is no fault to find in Vasilisa. And that repeats itself another night. And finally, Baba Yaga and Vasilisa have an interaction in which she asks a few questions. And Baba Yaga has these servants, which are 3 pairs of hands. And then she wants to ask about the pairs of hands. And the little doll says, no, you shouldn't ask. And Baba Yaga respects that and says, well, you've seemed like you've been, initiated. How do you know so much? And she says, by the blessing of my mother. And with that, Baba Yaga had enough. And she says, okay, that's it. Here's the skull on fire. Just go. And Vasilisa wants to say thank you and thank you and thank you. The doll says you should just go. And she leaves. And as she's returning to the forest, it's the same forest physically, archetypally speaking. It's a different forest. And she is traveling through this forest back to her house. She now holds a skull with fire. She has spent time in Baba Yaga's house. She has done the tasks. She has learned so much. She has seen so much. And as she returns to her house, the stepmother and the stepdaughters already think she's dead because it's been a while. But as they see her, they are very surprised. And she just spends the night there, and the skull watches and watches and watches this step family. And by morning, the trio is burned to cinders. So here, a very kind of little short version of this tale. And I wonder, Suzanne, is there a moment in the story that you see yourself at, or that calls more to you?
I love the idea of the forest being transformed. I think that that it's a different forest now. That sense of when we go through the trials that we do in our life as we come of age, or come into like a new phase, as I have in midlife, that I do find that the terrain that once felt maybe scary or threatening or challenging has really changed. That my whole attitude towards it and the way that I take my place in it has really changed. And so I love that image. And I also feel that part of this for me has been learning to listen to my intuition more. And so I love the idea of this little doll as almost like a symbol of one's intuition and being able to listen inwardly. And that's been a big part of that transformation for me.
That's beautiful. I also love the idea of the forest. And it's such an important knowing for us women is, that feeling of, oh my God, again, do I need to do this again? Do I need to go through this again? And it's never again. It's always a different forest. And you have new insights into this forest, into yourself. You have different guides and allies as you are traveling the forest again. There are new things about it, but there is definitely more knowing, more experience as we go through it. One of the things you mentioned about the doll as well, that intuition, right, that is given from mother to daughter, not necessarily biological mother, not necessarily a physical mother as well, a mother figure, but it comes from that lineage of women. And that is something that I believe is strengthened in midlife because we have so many voices within us telling us what we need to do, how we should do it, what is right, what is wrong, how do we need to behave, who do we need to accept, and who do we need to please. And at midlife, these voices, they become a little bit more quiet, more silent, or better, the voice of intuition becomes louder.
Yes.
And there's no other way. You need to listen, right? And it might be also one of the greatest resources, inner resource that a woman has, intuition. And when it comes to traveling these times of midlife and other initiations in our lives, intuition is a precious resource. Intuition is the guide, it's the soul voice.
One thing I also love about that story, and it kind of shifts us into talking about patterns. We've mentioned a little bit about pleasing and perfectionism so far. And I know that you and I have some overlap in the themes that we work with. I speak a lot with my clients around claiming sovereignty as well, and also thinking about the pressures that women face to please and perform. And I was just thinking about that moment where the doll says, don't keep thanking her. So interesting, because that inclination to keep, oh, thank you for letting me go, don't do that. It's like part of that claiming of the sovereignty and the confidence to move forward in one's life is no longer doing that anymore.
Absolutely. And it was a fair exchange, right? She did a lot of work for Baba Yaga. Baba Yaga received a
Right.
lot from Vasilisa there as well. She taught a lot. Vasilisa learned a lot. She received a lot, but she also given a lot to Baba Yaga. That forever grateful attitude is not necessary. And a lot of the times we have that, right? Someone does something. I see it as a lot in relationships as well. Women are imposed many different tasks around the home. And when a mother, when a friend, when a husband, someone comes and helps and does a little bit, is the feeling of being forever grateful, which is it's not necessary. People are participating.
You're contributing as you should.
Exactly.
Yeah, and it's like, like you said, not only has she done a lot in exchange, but she was basically saying, thank you for freeing me from the imprisonment that you've imposed on me. And instead, it's like I'm claiming my freedom. I've claimed and earned my freedom, both by respecting your privacy and doing the work you've asked of me. And it wouldn't really be like a claiming of her own sovereignty if it came with that.
Absolutely. That's such a great point because, yes, when she arrives at the house, Baba Yaga kind of takes over, takes her in, right? She can't just leave.
Well, we've spoken a lot in these different stories about the kind of people-pleasing tendency. And I was just wondering, because I often work with perfectionism and control as themes that women in midlife are often finding that they're struggling with and that are kind of keeping them stuck. And, without necessarily needing to tell us the stories, can you think of some specific stories that kind of speak to those patterns? And how can myth kind of help illuminate patterns like that, our psychological patterns, and the deeper needs beneath them, as well as how to get free from them?
I love the topic of perfectionism because it is a theme that holds us back in life, right? How do we present ourselves when it comes to the creative life? Women tend to not manifest until it's perfect. It's never going to be perfect, right? The idea of perfection is an illusion, absolutely. Some of the myths that I like are sealskin, soulskin, the sulky tale of letting go. I think the idea as well, the motif of letting go is an important one. Stories of descent as well. So Demeter and Persephone, Inanna, all these stories of descent. I'm trying to mention some of the most common ones. These stories are also important tales for us to understand that we need to break free from the molds that hold us. We need to welcome the unknown, welcome the descent, welcome the transformation that brings, even though some people in the topside world might be very uncomfortable, very upset with our going, right? With our transformation, with our inadequacies as well. When we let go of perfectionism, we step into our inadequacies. Before we reach that feeling of authenticity, there's a state there of accepting the inadequacies. And once they are accepted, it becomes authenticity, right? It's the flaws, the lacks, they become our authentic experience in the world. But those inadequacies is also another thing for us to look at. Where can I lean into my inadequacy? What is something handmade? And because it is handmade, it is soul driven. It is not perfect how the world expects it, what the soul expects. And how can I lean in? How can I step into my inadequacy?
Oh, I love that. I love both that question, how can I step into my inadequacy? And also what you said about having to upset others, being willing to upset others. And I think Persephone is a great example of that.
Mm.
And the idea of embracing our inadequacies actually brought to mind something I read this morning, where, we've all heard about the necessity of taking risks and being willing to make mistakes and be in the messiness of it. But what I was reading was literally about the neuroscience of that and how there are two parts to the creative process that researchers can now see in the brain, where we actually have to go through the failure part before we can get to the part where we have the new ideas and insights.
Indeed, that's very interesting. And it takes us back to the archetypal pattern of trial and error. One of the things you mentioned before about the inadequacy, it's I think a big question for midlife is which parts of me were borrowed and what belongs to my soul. And then we go back to that Vasilisa's work of discernment. How can we separate poppy seed from dirt? How can we separate what is medicine, what is soul material, what is self really from what was borrowed? And it is such a powerful season, in life. It's the season for women to stop abandoning themselves.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you brought it back around to self abandonment because I think coming home to oneself in midlife is such a rich and important theme. Well, this was such a lovely exchange, and I really appreciate you making some of those connections for us. We have some stories that you've referenced that I can put into the show notes so that people can look them up if they'd like. And before we move on, I just want to ask you if you'd like to share with our audience what's coming up for you. What are you most excited about right now?
I think the thing I'm most excited about is a course that I'm going to deliver next year. I can't share much yet, but it's going to be a very beautiful journey, probably a 7 months long program into the heart of story, into some of the themes that are the most important to me. There are going to be some myths that are not very common, not very well known. I think that's one of my intention. And then some comparative stories as well. It's going to be very experiential, bringing a lot of mythic sensibility to life. So I'm definitely excited about that. And I love the little ants work also that I do every day with Women in Mythology, which is my business. There's the podcast, there are some on-demand courses, there are some smaller workshops, the private sessions, the mentorships, the sharing on Instagram, all of this really inspire me. And I love having different modalities on which I can express mythic material.
Well, thank you so much for being here. It's been so lovely to have this conversation with you, and I look forward to continuing to follow your work.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I hope to welcome you at Women in Mythology.
Before we close today, I wanted to share one final reflection from the Vasilisa story that we talked about. One of the details we didn't get to explore is the fiery skull that Vasilisa brings home with her. In the story, that skull burns her stepmother and stepsisters to cinders It's a dramatic ending, but symbolically it points to something important. During her time with Baba Yaga, Vasilisa isn't just completing impossible tasks. She's taking in some darker, witchy energy. By the time she leaves Baba Yaga's house, she's no longer the innocent girl she was at the beginning of the tale. She's carrying a kind of inner fire, a protective force that knows what to burn away. And that's part of the psychological work of midlife. We start to see the patterns that have kept us small, and we need to integrate some of that Baba Yaga fierceness to break those patterns, to become whole, to claim our sovereignty, and to protect what's true in us. This has been The Deepening with Suzanne Larue. If you enjoy conversations that lead you deeper into self and soul, I hope you'll subscribe, follow, and tune in for future episodes. Thanks for joining us.